right? Don't hurt people, right? لا ضرر ولا ضرار. So that's a general statement. Don't hurt yourself or others. Don't be hurting things. Don't harm things, right? Very general. So when something came that carries hurting people, they would say by qiyas, this is haram, right? Like smoking, right? It harms yourself and it harms others, right? So it's obviously haram because of that text. It doesn't need to be mentioned by text. This is pretty agreed upon. Very few people disagree with qiyas. Very few. The four madhabs agreed on qiyas. Imam Ibn Hazm said no, qiyas is just human thought. So therefore, we don't want human thought involved in using scripture to rule our lives. He wanted it very pure. Which is his opinion. He's a minority in looking at Islamic law. But pretty much everybody agrees on that. So now you have a concept called istihsan. Istihsan. Anybody ever heard of that? Okay, so that's why we're here. Istihsan is a ruling where basically there's a general ruling that's there, and so you can use that to prohibit, as we said, وَلَا ضَرَرَ وَلَا ضِرَارَ. You can use that to prohibit other things, as is the qiyas. So there's a qiyas, then there's a weaker qiyas khafi. There is a weaker way, it's not as literal, or it doesn't fit the literal thing, but it makes sense. So you tastahsin hadha al-amr, istihsan. And this is agreed upon by the four madhabs as well, but with strict oversight. You can't just be anybody making istihsan. You have to be a faqih, somebody who's been trained in the sciences of Islamic law. Right? So one example of this is aqdul istina'. Aqdul istina'. So there's a rule mentioned in hadith and agreed upon by other scholars that says you cannot buy or sell something that you don't have or doesn't exist. This is a rule that was said by the Prophet ﷺ, right? But all of the scholars, when faced with an issue, what if I am a person that makes garments, right? I make my abayas, right? And so I sell them. But I haven't made one yet. I don't even have the actual material to make it out of. But you know I make it, and that's what my job is. So you come to me and you say, I'm going to pay you, and I'm going to make a transaction that you're going to make me 5 abayas, right? Istihsan said that transaction is allowed. Because it's something that they say its understanding between the people is customarily, now this is a different thing that we'll get to, is called urf, that people know that that's going to happen. Whereas in the ruling about not allowing somebody to sell or buy something that they don't own or that doesn't exist yet is there because people trick other people and then they make justifications at the end. So obviously in this istihsan ruling, if somebody said, you know, well, I can't make that for you. Well, then you have to pay the money back, right? So then it's going to be regulated, right? Another one, there's istihsan in the Quran, but this is just understanding the concept. It's not going to, might be a little bit deep for you, but the concept of wasiyah, right? Wasiyah is saying, and it's in the Quran mentioned, that you can leave money to a person that will only be given after you die, right? But there's an Islamic principle that seems to be contradictory, but we're using istihsan here, that says when you die, you don't own something because you don't exist anymore. You see what I'm saying? So how could you give it to anyone? Right? Islamic law says there's something called tarika, wiratha. That is not your money anymore. It's the people that have the inheritance law, they get that money. But if you did a wasiyah before you died, because the Quran allowed it, then that is the exception to that rule because the Quran is allowing it. So this is a very easy way to apply it because it's mentioned. The very difficult and very touchy and careful way is to apply istihsan on something that doesn't have a text, and now you're trying to say that there's a justification outside of the general ruling that we all know. So I'll give you maybe one. We'll get there with masalih. It's the same thing as masalih al-mursala that we'll get to. But generally, I'm sure you've all heard the confrontational, or what was controversial is the better word. It's part of confrontational. The ayah that says وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ in the Quran. And if a wife is arrogant and disrespectful in some very harsh way, then you would advise her and talk to her and give her, an advice. And then after that, you would stop, staying in the same bed with her and kind of turn your back on her, show that you're upset. And then in the end it said you could physically reprimand her, right? This is a big controversial issue, right? So istihsan would say, okay, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the general custom was, if some man, went on his wife's shoulder or grabbed her arm and said, what you're doing is really offensive to me. This would be the application justly applied, because the Prophet ﷺ, when asked about it, it was specified, ضَرْبٌ غَيْرُ مُبَرَّةٌ, some sort of physical reprimand that's not violent in any way. It's not crazed violence, it's not hitting and bruising and breaking bones and drawing blood. It's just some sort of a physical thing to say, I'm very upset with you. So culturally, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the situation would be like, oh man, the man, Rajal, ghadban alayh. There would be a little bit of khawf. My husband's upset with me. He doesn't like what I'm doing. I've really overstepped my mind. So then she's like, astaghfirullah, and she changes her way. That was a cultural reality that probably was dominant. Nowadays, women are mushkila. You see?
It's opposite.
Yeah, it's the opposite. Now she does that. It's like, what? Are you telling me I'll call the police? I'll beat you with the phone and everything else. Right? You don't touch me. Women have a different reality. It's a whole different way. So, Abu Bakr al-Jazairi, not me. Abu Bakr al-Jazairi, the famous scholar that teaches in Medina Munawwara in the mosque. Okay? It's called Bara'atul Dhimma, what I'm doing right now. It's a different fiqh rule. Right? So he said on his tafsir to this ayah, if you know that it will make your situation worse by applying this verse, then you cannot apply this verse. Istihsanan and i'tibaran lil masalih. Right? These are two rulings that would negate a general ruling that was allowed customarily because of the harm that it brings and because of the goodness that would come if you left that situation. That maybe there's a different way that might be. There are many other ayahs, like Ashiruhunna bil ma'ruf. This is an ayah that's telling you how to deal with any situation, to live with your wives in the good, best manners and character. Right? So that would probably, in our context today, be more effective in making a sister feel like, you know what, I'm doing this rude, disrespectful thing, and he just keeps killing me with love. Right? Yeah. So that's istihsan. So then you have a concept called istihsab, which is also related to something called aslu bara'at al-dhimma. Istihsab is basically saying it's part of this ruling that the scholars said in Islamic law. They said al-aslu fil ashya' al-ibaha. And they said al-aslu fil ashya' al-nafa wa adam al-darar. In dealing with the worldly life and everything around us, the general ruling of Islamic law as an overarching principle is that everything is permissible, except what the Quran and the Sunnah has prohibited. Right? So to come and prohibit something 1,400 years after the Quran and the Sunnah that doesn't have either a clear verse of the Quran or a hadith or a clear analogy is a problem. You have to leave things the way they were. You can't just start making rules, which you'll see in a second. This seems to conflict with something called Sadd al-Dhari'ah, right? So you're starting to see that it is a science. It can't be solved in an hour lecture, right? But I'm giving you the tools to see we don't come from just some mullahs with beards going around, that's haram, beat the woman, kill the guy in the soccer field or whatever. Those people are probably not trained well in fiqh. Because you're dealing with the ignorant people that have been living in war and all this, and you start applying all these rules that are misapplied and not understood, and the people's situation is not understood. This is what happens without fiqh. The big disgrace of our ummah because of these people applying sharia without fiqh. Yeah, you see the problem? Yeah, so fiqh is a very important reality. So there's another thing called urf. And this kind of, the roots of this started with Imam Malik. Imam Malik, radiyallahu anhu, he was from the tabi'in, and he had this opinion because sometimes somebody would come to him and say, here's a hadith. And he would say, well, mashallah, it's a hadith. And then the person would say, I know so-and-so said so-and-so. He said, those people are decent people. He said, but the problem is, people of Medina that I've lived around my whole life, and now I'm in my 50s, 60s, nobody understood that hadith. And so then they would say, but it's a hadith. It's from the Prophet ﷺ. He said, but it doesn't seem like it was an overarching, important, prioritized reality, because guess what? Medina is made up of the great-grandchildren of all the companions. So all those people and all their sons and grandsons and granddaughters never heard of this thing, right? That you're saying came from the Prophet. These people, Abu Bakr and Umar and Abu Huraira and all their grandchildren, Aisha and Hafsa and Salama, all of the great followers and scholars of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were living in Medina, and they stayed there because they were doing that tabarrukan bin Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They wanted to take the blessing of closeness to the Prophet ﷺ their whole life, right? So you're saying none of those heard of that, right? So Imam Malik would take a different angle at understanding the hadith, because he would say, اعتبار عمل أهل المدينة العرف السائد, that the taking in account the way of thinking of all of the people in Medina, right? So he would prefer that over one hadith, right? Imam Abu Hanifa had a different one, which is, it's a different ruling because we're talking about urf. So later on, scholars talked about urf, and they said, what is the role of custom and culture in dealing with Islamic law? So it kind of relates a few of these back to each other, and it basically says, if there's not a text that forbids it, but the people kind of had some sort of angle of interpretation from a different Muslim area, but that culture does not take that interpretation, and it's a matter of interpretation, then al-urf yuhakkam fi nusus al-ghamida. That when you have an unclear text that's vague, it's not decisively dealing with something, it's a general thing, right? And then one culture of Muslims said, related to that is this, and so we should prohibit this. The other one said, there's nothing wrong with that. And so that doesn't come from that. So one example that we gave, that mashallah some of the local scholar here have agreed, but the scholars that come from the Muslim world have a different cultural interpretation. Like for example, the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ cursed men who imitate women and vice versa. Obviously, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكْرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, God created men and women different, and they were meant to be that way. And so one should not try to be the other, because that's not the way God created you, right? It's a very basic, simple understanding. So in the Muslim world, right, for as long as we know, wearing necklaces, for example, was seen as something specific to the zina of a woman, right? So in that context, this hadith can be understood to mean it's prohibited for a man to wear a necklace. And that's correct, because that's the way the society looks at it. They've made that as a cultural interpretation. Revelation did not get them to this point, nor is it historical reality, because